It was a late afternoon, and the park was nearly empty, except for a few kids playing basketball on one of the courts. The fading sun cast long shadows on the cracked concrete, and the sound of sneakers squeaking echoed through the quiet space. Marcus was sitting on a bench, a textbook open in front of him, but his mind wasn't on his homework. His fingers tapped restlessly against the pages. He tried to focus on the math problems, but his thoughts kept wandering to the idea of escaping the monotony of his life. He'd never been one to sit still for long. There was too much to explore, too many things to dream about. That's when he saw her. Lily was running across the park, her face flushed with fear, her long brown hair bouncing behind her as she glanced nervously over her shoulder. A group of older boys, about 3 or 4 of them, were chasing after her. They were laughing, taunting her as they drew closer. It wasn't the first time Marcus had seen these boys cause trouble in the park, but seeing them go after someone like Lily, someone who clearly didn't belong here, sparked something in him. Without thinking, Marcus stood up. He was tall for his age, but these boys were older, probably high schoolers, and much stronger than he was. But he didn't care. He couldn't just sit back and watch. His mother had always told him that the right thing to do was always the hardest thing to do, and today, that truth seemed more real than ever. He rushed toward the group, his heart pounding. As he closed the distance, he shouted, his voice steady but loud enough to draw attention. "Hey, leave her alone." The boys turned toward him, smirking as they sized him up. The leader, a tall guy with a scowl permanently etched on his face, sneered, "What's your problem, kid? This doesn't concern you." Marcus stood firm, fists clenched, but he didn't back down. "Yeah, it does. She's just a kid. Pick on someone your own size." Lily, breathless and terrified, had stopped running now, standing just a few feet behind Marcus, her wide eyes filled with gratitude and fear. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, no one moved. Marcus could feel his palms starting to sweat, his legs a little shaky, but he couldn't back down now. Not after everything he had seen in his life, not after what he had been taught. The bully took a step forward, eyes narrowed. "You don't know who you're messing with, kid." Before he could react, Marcus quickly scanned the situation and noticed a stick lying near the ground. He grabbed it and raised it, not in a threatening way, but enough to show that he wasn't backing down. The bully stopped, sensing the sudden change in the situation. "Go home," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying across the park, "and leave her alone." There was a long pause before the leader gave a low growl of frustration. After a tense moment, he turned to his friends. "This isn't over," he muttered, and with one final glare at Marcus, he and his friends walked away, grumbling. Marcus stood there for a moment, still holding the stick, his heart racing. When he finally lowered it, he turned to look at Lily. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with shock and relief. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft now. Lily nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I can't believe you did that," she whispered. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Marcus shrugged, trying to brush it off. "I just did what anyone would do." But inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him. Maybe it was just the rush of adrenaline, or maybe it was because he had finally stood up for something he cared about. Whatever it was, he knew this wasn't the last time he would see Lily. They had just crossed paths in a way that would forever tie their fates together. As they stood there in the empty park, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger than both of them. The days following the incident at the park were filled with an odd sense of anticipation for Marcus. He hadn't expected to see Lily again, much less form a friendship with her, but there was something about the way she looked at him, as if he had done more than just saved her from a gang of bullies. The moment had bonded them in a way that was difficult to explain. The following week, Marcus was walking home from school when he spotted her again. Lily was sitting on a bench under a tree in the park, her head buried in a book, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders. He couldn't help but smile. Despite the differences in their lives, her pristine clothes and polished shoes, his worn sneakers and faded jeans, there was something strangely familiar in the way she sat there, immersed in a world of her own. "Hey you," Marcus called out, waving as he approached. Lily looked up, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Marcus, wow, I didn't think I'd run into you here again." He grinned, sitting down beside her on the bench. "Well, this part's a pretty good spot to hang out. Not too far from home, you know." Lily closed her book and tilted her head. "True, and you're right. I never really paid much attention to it before." She paused, glancing around the park as though seeing it in a new light. "I guess I've been too focused on everything else. School, family, the whole perfect life thing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Perfect life." Lily's smile faltered slightly. "Yeah, I guess that's what people think when they look at my life. My dad's a businessman. We have money. We live in a big house. People see all that and assume everything's perfect." She sighed, pushing her hair out of her face. "But it's not. I mean, yeah, I get all the material things, but sometimes I feel like I'm just invisible." Marcus blinked, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "Invisible? But you're the daughter of Thomas Caldwell, right? The guy who owns half the city." Lily laughed softly, but there was a bitter edge to it. "Yeah, that's me. But that doesn't mean anything when you're just a kid trying to figure out who you are in the middle of all the chaos. My dad's always working, and my mom, well, she's never around much. It's like I'm always surrounded by people, but no one ever really sees me, you know." Marcus sat quietly, absorbing her words. He'd never considered that someone with so much wealth could feel so alone. He had grown up with very little, but at least his mother was always there. They might not have had much, but they had each other. "I get it," Marcus said finally, his voice soft. "I mean, I don't get the whole rich kid thing, but I get being alone. My mom works long hours too. She's always trying to make ends meet, and sometimes it feels like it's just me and the street." Lily looked at him intrigued. "I never really thought about it that way. I guess I've always been so caught up in my own problems that I didn't realize other people have their own struggles." "Yeah, we all have our battles," Marcus said. "But at least you have the chance to make things different for yourself. You just have to choose what you want your life to be, not what others expect it to be." Lily nodded, her eyes thoughtful. I think you're right. Maybe I've been so focused on trying to live up to my dad's expectations that I forgot about what I want." There was a long pause between them as the weight of their conversation settled in the air. Marcus didn't want to say the wrong thing, but he could feel a connection forming between them, a quiet understanding that crossed the boundaries of their different worlds. "You know," Marcus said after a moment, "you don't have to live up to anyone else's expectations. You can make your own path." Lily smiled at him, a real smile, the kind that made her eyes sparkle. "Maybe I'll try to remember that." "Thanks, Marcus." As they sat there, the park seemed quieter, as if the world had slowed down just for them. Marcus realized that in helping Lily that day, he hadn't just saved her from bullies. He'd opened a door to something far more meaningful, a friendship, and that, he was beginning to understand, could be the most valuable thing of all. As they said their goodbyes that evening, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something important. Their bond, though still new, was growing fast, and Marcus was beginning to see that sometimes the most unlikely friendships can change your life in ways you never expect. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon when everything changed. Marcus had been heading to the park, his mind on the usual routine. Maybe play a little basketball, meet up with some of his friends, and enjoy a few hours of escaping the weight of school and responsibility. But when he spotted Lily again, standing near the edge of the park, something didn't feel right. She was alone, looking around nervously, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Marcus hesitated for a moment. She didn't look like her usual self. Her shoulders were tense, and there was an unease in her posture. She looked as though she was waiting for someone or something. He walked over to her, his sneakers making little noise against the sidewalk. "Hey, Lily, you okay?" She startled slightly when she saw him, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and relief. "Marcus, I'm fine. Just waiting for a ride." But Marcus could tell something was off. Her words didn't match the tension in her voice. He took a step closer, looking around the park. There was an unfamiliar figure standing by one of the trees, a man who looked out of place in the otherwise quiet park. His clothes were too formal for this setting, dark slacks, a long coat, and polished shoes. And the way he was watching Lily, and made Marcus uneasy. Before he could say anything, Lily's phone buzzed. She glanced down at it, her face suddenly drained of color. Without warning, she began to walk briskly in the direction of the man by the tree. Marcus watched, instinct telling him to follow her, but he hesitated. Was it just someone she knew? Maybe it was her father or a family friend. Then, things took a sharp turn. The man took a step toward Lily, his movements quick and aggressive. Without warning, he grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him. She stumbled in surprise, her phone falling from her hand, the screen cracking against the pavement. Lily let out a sharp gasp, trying to pull away, but the man's grip was too strong. "Lily, let her go," Marcus shouted, his heart racing as he ran toward them. The man turned, glaring at Marcus with cold eyes. "This doesn't concern you, kid," he sneered, tightening his hold on Lily. She winced in pain, her face pale as she struggled. Marcus felt a surge of anger, his body moving before he could fully think through the consequences. He didn't know who this man was, but he could see enough to know that he didn't belong here. This wasn't some misunderstanding, it was an outright threat. "Let her go," Marcus repeated, his voice firm, though his hands shook with adrenaline. The man didn't listen. Instead, he pulled Lily closer, his arm around her neck, in a way that made Marcus's stomach drop. Lily was terrified, and the thought of her being hurt sent a wave of panic through Marcus. His mind raced. What could he do? He was just a kid. He had no weapons, no real training, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let her be taken. Without thinking, he lunged forward, his body colliding with the man's side, knocking him off balance. The man grunted in surprise, and for a moment, he let go of Lily. It was enough for her to break free, stumbling backward toward Marcus. "Run!" Marcus shouted at her. "Get to the police station now." But before she could take a step, the man recovered, spinning around with fury in his eyes. He grabbed Marcus by the collar, lifting him off the ground with surprising strength. Marcus's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't stop struggling. The man wasn't going to get away with this, not with Lily. In that split second, Marcus's hand found something, a thick stick lying on the ground. He swung it, hitting the man square in the side. The impact forced him to loosen his grip, just enough for Marcus to break free. "Go!" Marcus yelled again, his voice hoarse. "I'll handle this." Lily hesitated, fear still in her eyes, but she nodded, running in the direction of the nearest building. The man, now furious, lunged at Marcus again, but this time Marcus was ready. He jabbed the stick forward, hitting the man's leg and forcing him to stumble back. The man growled in frustration, but before he could make another move, the sound of sirens grew louder. In the distance, a police car was speeding toward them. The man hesitated, then turned and bolted, disappearing into the trees. Marcus stood there, breathless, his heart still racing. His body ached from the adrenaline, but there was no time to stop and think. Lily had made it to safety, and the police were closing in. As they'd arrived, Marcus tried to explain what had happened, but he could tell from their expressions that they already knew this wasn't just a random incident. They promised to investigate, but it was clear that the danger wasn't over yet. Lily came running back, her face still pale, but her eyes full of gratitude. She threw her arms around Marcus, pulling him into a tight hug. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Marcus, still shaken, hugged her back. "You don't need to thank me. I couldn't just let him take you." But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. The world was about to change for both of them, and this was only the beginning. The day after the incident, Marcus was still reeling. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, the way the man had grabbed Lily, how close things had come to spiraling out of control. It was only a stroke of luck that the police had arrived when they did, and the whole experience had shaken him to his core. But what bothered him more than the danger was how much he cared about Lily. She had become more than just the girl he'd helped. She was a friend, someone who seemed to understand him in a way that no one else had. That afternoon, as Marcus sat at the kitchen table, trying to focus on his homework, there was a knock at the door. It was a sound that didn't fit in the small apartment he and his mom lived in, where visits were usually limited to close friends or the occasional delivery. His mother opened the door, and Marcus immediately recognized the figure standing in the doorway, a tall man in a suit with sharp features and a calm but commanding presence. It was Thomas Caldwell, Lily's father. Marcus stood up instinctively, feeling his heart race. He didn't know what to expect, but the situation from the park was still fresh in his mind. Why was he here? "Good afternoon," Thomas said, extending a hand toward Marcus's mother. "Mrs. Taylor, I assume?" "Yes, that's me," she said, shaking his hand, her face a mix of confusion and politeness. "I'm Thomas Caldwell," he continued. "I'm sure you've heard of me. I wanted to come by personally to thank Marcus for what he did yesterday. What he did for my daughter. There are no words to describe it." Marcus froze, not knowing how to react. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. His mother, on the other hand, seemed stunned, and she motioned for Thomas to come inside. They all sat down in the modest living room, the contrast between Thomas's expensive suit and their worn-out furniture almost comical. "Marcus," Thomas said, his voice warm but firm, "I owe you a debt I can't repay with words alone. What you did for Lily, well, most people would have run in the other direction, but not you. You stepped in without hesitation and saved her from something far worse than you could imagine." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the weight of the moment. He'd never been one to seek praise or attention, and hearing it from someone like Thomas Caldwell made him feel both proud and uneasy at the same time. "I just did what anyone would do," Marcus muttered, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks. "I couldn't just let him take her." Thomas smiled, though there was a deep gratitude in his eyes. "Most people would have hesitated, but you didn't. That speaks volumes about your character, Marcus. You didn't do it for recognition. You did it because it was the right thing to do." His mother, who had been quietly listening, leaned forward. "I'm glad Lily's safe, Mr. Caldwell. But why are you here, really? You didn't need to come all this way. I'm sure you have a lot on your plate." Thomas paused, then looked directly at Marcus. "I know this may seem sudden, but I want to offer you something. A gesture of my gratitude. You see, you've not only saved my daughter, but you've also opened my eyes to something I've been neglecting. People like you, with real heart and courage, are rare. I believe you deserve more than just thanks." Marcus looked at him, puzzled. "More than thanks?" Thomas nodded, taking out a folder from his briefcase and placing it on the coffee table. He opened it slowly, revealing documents. "I want to offer you something, Marcus. A chance to change your life, a home for starters. And more importantly, I want to offer you an opportunity, an education at the best school. I've already arranged everything." Marcus's head spun as he processed the words. A home? A school? He hadn't been expecting anything like this. He'd never imagined someone like Thomas Caldwell, someone with so much, would offer him something so significant. His mother's voice was thick with surprise. "What are you saying, Mr. Caldwell?" "I'm saying that I've arranged for Marcus to have a fully paid house in a much safer neighborhood with all expenses covered. I've also set up a scholarship for him to attend the same private school Lily goes to. A chance to give him a future that he deserves." Marcus was silent, his mind struggling to keep up. He had never in his life imagined such an opportunity. The idea of living in a nicer house, going to a school where he could be more than just the poor kid. It all felt like a dream. But it was real. I don't know what to say," Marcus stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His thoughts were swirling. This was more than he could process. Thomas stood up and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You don't need to say anything. Just know that you've earned this. Not because of anything I did, but because of the way you acted when it mattered most. You've proven yourself." As Thomas left, Marcus stood frozen in place, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The next few days felt like a blur to Marcus. The offer from Thomas Caldwell was still on his mind, overwhelming in its magnitude. How could someone like him, someone from a modest background, be given such an opportunity? A new home, a scholarship to an elite school, a life that seemed worlds away from his small apartment and the struggles of everyday life. It was a dream, but one that felt both exciting and terrifying. That afternoon, Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the papers Thomas had left with them. His mother had read through them too, and after a long conversation, they'd agreed to visit the house Thomas had arranged for them. But the weight of the decision was heavy. The idea of leaving their cramped apartment was tempting, but it also meant stepping into a world that Marcus wasn't sure he belonged in. "Marcus, are you ready?" His mother's voice called from the other room. He stood up, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, I'm coming." They were heading to the house that had been arranged for them, his new home, as Thomas Caldwell had promised. As they drove through the city, Marcus watched the landscape shift. The streets, once filled with rundown buildings and vacant lots, gradually gave way to quieter, well-kept neighborhoods with manicured lawns and large homes. The difference was stark, and it made Marcus feel out of place. He glanced over at his mother, who seemed deep in thought. She had always been practical, making do with what they had, but he could see the hope in her eyes. As they'd pulled into the driveway of a large house with a beautiful garden, Marcus's heart began to race. The house was everything he had imagined and more. It was 2 stories high, with a red brick facade and wide windows that seemed to invite sunlight in from every angle. A large oak tree stood proudly in the front yard, its branches stretching out like welcoming arms. "Is this ours?" Marcus whispered, half in disbelief. His mother's eyes glistened with emotion. "Yes, Marcus, this is ours now." They stepped out of the car, and Marcus felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. This wasn't just a house, it was a whole new life. As they walked up to the door, he noticed how perfectly everything was maintained. The flowers in the garden were bright and vibrant, and the grass was neatly trimmed. It was everything he had dreamed of, but it felt so far from the life he knew. The door opened, and a man in a uniform greeted them warmly. "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor," he said, motioning for them to enter. "Please come in. Everything's been prepared for your arrival." Marcus stepped inside and immediately felt the difference. The air smelled fresh, and everything was polished and new. The house had an open floor plan, with a spacious living room that flowed into a dining area and a modern kitchen. He couldn't believe this was real. His mother walked through the house, her hands gently brushing over the furniture and walls, as if trying to take it all in. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. As they explored the rest of the house, Marcus found himself struggling to believe that this was his new reality. A huge staircase led up to a second floor with spacious bedrooms. Everything was pristine, the kind of place people like Thomas Caldwell lived in. He couldn't help but feel a little out of place, like he didn't deserve this. Later that evening, as they sat down to dinner at their new dining table, Marcus's mother looked at him with a proud smile. "This is our chance, Marcus. A chance for you to go to a great school, to be someone, to have a future." Marcus nodded, his mind still racing. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just about a bigger house or a fancy education. It was about the opportunity to change the course of his life. It was about showing the world that he wasn't defined by where he came from, but by who he chose to be. As he looked out the window at the new neighborhood, the sound of crickets filling the cool evening air, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something bigger than he could have ever imagined. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, something beyond the material things he now had. He had his new life, but the world outside was still unpredictable. The connection he had with Lily, his friend, the one person who truly understood what he had been through, was still his anchor. And he realized, deep down, that he had more to learn about this new life and how it fit into his heart. Tomorrow, he would face a new school, new people, and an entirely new world. But he wasn't alone. He had his mother, and he had Lily, and together, he felt they could handle whatever came next. The morning of Marcus's first day at his new school arrived with a wave of nervous anticipation. As he stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the collar of the new shirt he'd bought with the school's uniform, he couldn't help but feel a tight knot in his stomach. He was about to enter a world completely different from the one he knew. The polished hallways, the elite students, the unfamiliar faces. All of it felt overwhelming. "You're going to do great, Marcus," his mother said from the doorway, offering a reassuring smile. Her eyes were full of hope, but Marcus could see the anxiety there too. She was just as uncertain about this new chapter in their lives as he was. He nodded, giving her a small smile in return. "Yeah, I'd hope so. The car ride to the school felt longer than usual, the silence between them thick with unspoken thoughts. As they'd pulled up to the school's gates, Marcus could hardly believe his eyes. The campus was massive, sprawling lawns, modern buildings, and students in crisp uniforms walking in groups, chatting casually. It looked like something out of a movie, and for a moment, he felt a pang of doubt. "Just be yourself," his mother said softly, parking the car. "You're here because you earned it." Marcus nodded again, though his mind was already racing. Earned it. The words echoed in his mind as he stepped out of the car, trying to push aside his nervousness. He walked toward the entrance of the school, the heavy gates slowly closing behind him, almost symbolizing the door closing on his old life. Inside the school, everything was impeccably maintained. The floors gleamed, and the walls were adorned with art and awards. Marcus felt small as he walked down the hall, his eyes wide as he passed by students laughing, talking, and heading to their classes. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going, while he felt completely lost. A bell rang, signaling the start of the first period, and Marcus followed the flow of students toward a classroom. As he stepped inside, the chatter quieted, and all eyes turned to him. He wasn't sure if they were looking at him because he was new or because of the way he looked. His uniform fit, but it didn't feel quite like it belonged to him. He was still the same Marcus, the kid who grew up in a small apartment, not someone who belonged in a school like this. "Hey, you must be Marcus," a voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see a tall boy with a friendly smile standing beside him. "I'm Jake. I've seen you around a few times. You're in the new kid class, huh?" Marcus gave a small, awkward smile. "Yeah, I guess so." Jake's smile widened. "Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it. Everyone's a little lost at first." For the next few hours, Marcus tried his best to focus on the lessons, but it wasn't easy. The material was far more advanced than what he was used to, and his classmates were speaking in terms that seemed foreign to him. Still, he tried to keep up, not wanting to seem out of place. During lunch, Marcus found a quiet spot outside. As he sat at one of the tables, picking at his food, he saw Lily walking toward him. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air in the sea of unfamiliar faces. "Hey, Marcus," she called out, waving as she approached. Her usual cheerfulness was a welcome contrast to his unease. "Hey, Lily, how's your day been?" Marcus asked, his voice a little more relaxed now that she was there. Lily shrugged, sitting down next to him. "It's been fine. Just the usual," she said. "You, on the other hand, look like you're ready to crawl back into bed." Marcus let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, it's a lot to take in. I feel like I don't belong here." Lily gave him a sympathetic smile. "I get it. But you do belong here, Marcus. I mean, look at you. You stepped up when it counted, and that says something. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve to be here." He looked at her, surprised by the way she seemed to understand exactly how he felt. "Thanks, Lily. I'm just trying to figure things out." "You will," she said confidently. "You've already proven you can handle the tough stuff, a little school drama. That's nothing compared to what you've already been through." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of comfort in her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't need to feel like an outsider here. It wasn't about fitting in perfectly. It was about staying true to who he was and making the most of the opportunity in front of him. As the lunch bell rang, signaling the end of break, Marcus felt a little lighter. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but with Lily by his side, he felt like he could face whatever challenges came his way. The weeks following Marcus's first day at the new school had been a whirlwind. The initial shock of his new life had worn off, but the reality of fitting in still felt like a struggle. Every day was a balancing act between staying true to who he was and trying to keep up with the expectations of his new surroundings. Some days it felt like a battle he wasn't sure he could win, but with Lily's encouragement and the quiet strength he found within himself, Marcus pushed forward. It was during a routine history class, a few weeks into the semester, that Marcus's world was shaken again. But this time, it wasn't physical danger that threatened him. It was something much more subtle, a test of character. The teacher, Mr. Price, had just handed out the midterm papers. Marcus had studied hard, staying up late the night before, poring over textbooks and notes. He wasn't used to the advanced material, but he knew that this was his chance to prove to himself and to the others that he belonged here. As he flipped through the exam questions, his heart sank. The questions were difficult, far more challenging than he expected. They covered topics that, honestly, Marcus didn't feel fully prepared for. Some questions seemed to reference material from earlier in the year, stuff he hadn't been taught or didn't understand. His mind raced. He glanced at the clock and then at his classmates. Most of them were scribbling away confidently, their pens moving quickly across the paper. They weren't struggling the way he was. His thoughts began to spiral. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this after all. Maybe he wasn't as smart as everyone thought. As the class wore on, Marcus felt the pressure mounting. His eyes darted from his paper to his surroundings, and he began to feel the weight of the stares from a few students near him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Jake, the friendly boy who had helped him settle in, was sitting 2 rows ahead. Marcus noticed something unusual. Jake had his paper angled in a way that made it possible to see some of his answers. Without hesitation, Jake shot Marcus a quick glance and subtly nodded, as if offering a silent invitation. Marcus's stomach churned. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Jake was offering to let him cheat. It was as if the world had shifted on its axis. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. Part of him wanted to take the easy route. He could copy a few answers, make it through the test, and keep up appearances. It would be the simplest solution, a way to get past this without drawing attention to himself. But then, he remembered why he was here in the first place. This opportunity wasn't just about the house or the school or fitting in. It was about proving to himself that he could do better, that he was more than where he came from. He had worked hard for this moment. He had earned it. And now, here he was faced with a choice. Marcus looked down at his paper, his mind swirling. The temptation to cheat was strong, but so was his desire to stand on his own 2 feet. He thought of his mom, how hard she had worked to give him a chance, how she had always taught him the value of honesty. He thought of Lily, how she had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. With a quiet breath, Marcus made his decision. He pushed the temptation away, determined to finish the test on his own, even if it meant failing. After the bell rang, signaling the end of the exam, Marcus gathered his papers and stood up. He felt a sense of pride in his choice, though it didn't erase the fear in his chest. He wasn't sure how he'd done on the test, but at least he knew he had given it his best shot. As he walked out of the classroom, Jake caught up to him. "Hey man, you didn't take a look at my paper?" Marcus stopped in his tracks, looking Jake straight in the eye. "No, I didn't." Jake's expression faltered, but he quickly masked it with a half smile. "All right, man, but sometimes it's just easier that way." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he kept walking, his head held high. He had passed the test, but it wasn't just the exam that mattered. It was the test of his integrity. And that, he realized, was far more important than any grade. The weeks after the history exam were filled with a mix of relief and introspection for Marcus. He had made it through one of the hardest decisions of his life, and though the grade on his paper wasn't the best, the experience left him with a new sense of self-respect. It wasn't about perfect grades or fitting in. It was about standing firm in his values. That was what truly mattered. As the semester went on, Marcus found himself growing more comfortable in his new life. The school, though still intimidating at times, began to feel more like a place where he could succeed. His teachers started to notice his effort, and while he wasn't always the top of the class, his dedication earned him respect. Lily was always by his side, offering support, and his bond with her deepened as they shared more than just classes. They shared dreams, fears, and stories of their pasts. One afternoon, Marcus was walking out of his last class when he received an unexpected text. It was from an unknown number, and the message was short and to the point. "Meet me at the cafe after school. Thomas Caldwell." His heart skipped a beat. Why was Thomas reaching out to him? It had been a while since their last meeting, and Marcus had been so caught up in his own journey at the school that he hadn't thought much about the wealthy man who had changed his life. But the message seemed urgent. With a sense of curiosity and slight apprehension, he headed to the cafe after school. When he arrived, Thomas was already seated at a corner table, sipping on a coffee. He looked exactly the same as the first time Marcus had met him, confident, polished, and composed. But today there was a look of intensity in his eyes that caught Marcus off guard. "Marcus," Thomas said, standing up as he approached. "Good to see you. Please sit down." Marcus slid into the seat across from him, unsure of what to expect. The cafe was quiet, with only a few other people scattered around, but the air between them felt charged. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," Thomas began, his voice calm but purposeful. "I've been keeping an eye on your progress at school, and I'm genuinely impressed with how well you've been handling things. You've adapted quickly, you've been working hard, and most importantly, you've been doing it with integrity. I respect that." Marcus blinked, surprised by Thomas's words. "Thanks. I've just been trying to keep up." Thomas nodded. "I know. And that's why I'm here today. You see, I've always believed that success doesn't just come from talent or hard work. It also comes from character. And you've shown something that's rarer than anything I've seen in a long time: integrity. You made a choice during that history exam. You could have taken the easy way out, but you didn't. You chose to stand by what was right, even when it would have been easier to take a shortcut. That kind of decision sticks with people." Marcus sat back, absorbing Thomas's words. He hadn't realized how much his choice had mattered to someone else, especially someone like Thomas who had so much influence. "So I've been thinking," Thomas continued, "about how I can help you further. It's not just about money or a new house. It's about creating opportunities for people who deserve them, people like you. So I've arranged something that might interest you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Thomas smiled, pushing a thick envelope across the table. "Inside here are the details of an internship with one of my business ventures. It's a program designed for students like you, people with potential, but who might need that extra push. You'd be working alongside some of the brightest minds in the industry, learning firsthand what it's like to build something from the ground up." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. "An internship? With your company?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, and this could be the beginning of something much bigger. I'm not offering you this because of what I've done for you or because of your past. I'm offering it because you've proven that you have the right qualities to succeed. I believe in giving people a chance when they show they're ready for it." For a moment, Marcus was speechless. His mind raced with the possibilities. This wasn't just a random opportunity. This was the kind of break he had only ever dreamed of. It felt surreal, as if his entire world had shifted in the span of a few months, from a struggling student with no direction to someone who was now being handed a chance to shape his own future. "Marcus," Thomas said, his tone sincere, "I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to think about it. This is your opportunity to build something, whatever you want. It's in your hands now." Marcus took a deep breath, staring at the envelope in front of him. His heart raced, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was excitement. This was his moment, his chance to show the world what he could do, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever believed in him. With a newfound sense of clarity, Marcus looked up at Thomas. "Thank you. I'll take it. I won't let you down." As he left the cafe later that afternoon, the weight of the decision settled into him like a comfortable coat. He wasn't just a kid from a rough neighborhood anymore. He was someone with a future that was his to create. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt ready to walk it.